life, business, reinvention, and the lessons that outlive us. This is the Dave of the Dead podcast.
Hola a todos. Welcome back to Dave of the Dead. Today's guest, my friend and colleague, Luis Miguel Messianu. He didn't just work in culture. He helped define how culture shows up inside the biggest brands in the world. He's a pioneer of multicultural marketing, a creative visionary who saw the power of the U.S. Latino audience early and built his agencies, plural, culminating with Alma and his latest agency, which we're going to talk about today, some of the most influential agencies in the game. He's led iconic work from McDonald's, PepsiCo, State Farm, and others, to now pushing the boundaries with his next chapter in his agency called MEL. But Luis Miguel isn't just an ad man. He's a culture builder, a mentor, a bridge between worlds and between creativity and commerce, between past and future, Spanish and English. And today, among other things, we're talking about relevance and what it takes to shape an entire industry and keep reinventing and creating amidst all the hurdles that life and business can throw at you. Luis Miguel Messianu, welcome to Dave of the Dead, my friend.
Thank you so much, and I love the name. It makes me feel very alive, and I look forward to a great conversation.
That's good. It's better than feeling dead, and I appreciate that. Yes, and I want to say, for those who actually can see Luis Miguel, he has his Dave of the Dead background, and he's all in on this Dave of the Dead theme today. And I appreciate that. I appreciate your spirit. You know, it looks great. So here on Dave of the Dead, we talk about life, business, reinvention, and lessons that outlive us. And as is often the case, I'd like to start with your life. You've had an incredible life, and most people don't know you come from a Romanian family, but grew up in Mexico City. How did that shape you and turn you into the person you are today?
Both of my parents were Romanian. In fact, Romanian was my first language. That was the language spoken at home.
Incredible. So I want to hear about that. I want to hear about your dual upbringing, how that influenced, obviously, everything you're doing today. And ultimately, he also grew up in Mexico. And all of this made the man sitting in front of us today. So let's unpack that a little, and then we'll get into your business life as well.
Okay, well, my parents were both Romanian. My mom was born in Bucharest, and my dad was born in a small port town called Galați in the northeast of Romania. But they both fled, running away from Ceausescu, who was a dictator, and communism. And a friend in common introduced them in England. In fact, they both were living in England. And my dad spoke, I think, 7 or 8 languages. My mom spoke 6, including, fluent French. And apparently the head of finance of the subsidiary in Mexico City resigned abruptly. And one of the top guys said, why don't we send Messianu? He speaks all these languages. He didn't speak Spanish, but he did speak, obviously, Romanian. I think he spoke Italian. He spoke French. So he was sent on a, supposedly 2-year assignment that became a lifetime. They fell in love with Mexico, and I was literally made in London, born in Mexico City. And I have to say that as much as my blood is Romanian, I am proudly Mexican. I'm very, very grateful for an amazing upbringing. Obviously, different times, but Mexico was a mix of culture, a mix of, different passions. And in a way, it was the perfect setting for a creative lifestyle. Everything around me had to do with color, with optimism, with a sense of humor, with passion for arts, for crafts, for football, of course, music. So I'm again very fortunate to have spent my first years in Mexico.
Very cool. So mom and dad, Romanian, and that's your first language, you're saying, literally, as you were growing up, you're speaking Romanian and Spanish and English. Any others?
In terms of languages, well,
Yeah.
since I learned languages at an early age, I can defend myself in French, Italian, and Portuguese. I understand, most of it. If I spend a week in Paris, I can be dangerous enough to navigate France. And I love traveling. I love languages. Again, it's part of my upbringing.
Yeah. Amazing. Wow. You could be in the UN if all else fails, Luis Miguel. There's still time. That's amazing. Here I am with 2 languages. I'm not impressive. You are, that's quite a background. And so creatively, sort of what were the inspirations that shaped you? I've had people on this podcast talking about obviously television and movies, to Walt Disney, to mom and dad, to you name it. Who are your heroes? What inspired you and what sort of led you down this creative path?
Well, I would say curiosity was the main driver. I was always very curious. You mentioned Walt Disney. I was born the same day as Walt Disney, December 5th.
Get
And in
out
fact,
of here.
my daughter was also born December 5th, not only the same day, but the same time. Uh,
What?
my mom was always, even though she didn't work in the creative industries, she was an amazing drawer. In fact, in Romania, she was drawing maps. And I remember her always with a little pencil and paper, and she was always, sketching, doodling. And I don't know if that had an influence. The reality is that I always say that I'm a writer by conviction. I started writing at a very early age, and I mostly started writing as a process of self-discovery, as a process of almost like a defense mechanism. And I never thought that I could make a career out of writing. And I always played football, soccer, and I was the goalie. And when I was age 17, one of my teammates picked me up. It was a Sunday, very early in the morning, and I had partied a little bit the night before. So I told him, "Why don't you come upstairs while I take a quick shower, just to feel semi-human." And I had written something very personal, and he was nosy and he read it. I didn't know what he did for a living. All I knew was that he was a defensive player. So on the way to the game, he starts asking me, did you write this? And, at first I was a bit annoyed because, again, it was personal. But then he said, you know what? You are a really good writer. And he happened to be working at a small local advertising agency in Mexico City. And on Monday, he asked me to show up at the office. I showed up with a little detergent box with my write-ups.
Uh-huh.
And funny because the receptionist was the administrative assistant to the president. And she asked me, "Are you Mr. Messias?" And I said, "Have you been waiting for me for a long time?" And he overheard, it. And he said, "Well, that was a good beginning." Long story short, the guy started writing, started reading my write-ups and offered me a job on the spot. He said, if you're interested, I have a job for you. And the following Wednesday, I presented a radio campaign, and it went on the air on Friday. So I thought, oh my God, I was born for this. Seemed like a much easier craft and profession than it turned out to be. But I fell in love with the profession. In fact, I shifted gears. My dad wanted me to be a doctor or a dentist, but I fell in love with advertising. He almost had a heart attack when I told him that I wanted to pursue a career in advertising. But since the tender age of 17, I have never stopped writing. And as I say, I live to write and I write for a living.
Do you consider yourself a copywriter first and foremost? Like it's writing, it has
Yes.
nothing to do with, yeah. Are you an
Yeah.
artist though too? You can do graphics as well or less?
Well, now thanks to AI, I'm playing
You're
with,
an expert. You and your
but
friend
but you
Claude.
yeah, but you know what? I've always had a good eye, and I've been very flattered when art directors that have teamed up with me tell me, "Wow, you have a sense for visual communication," and but I'm a copywriter, and this business promotes you way too early in your career, but I never really abandoned the fact that my real gift is writing.
It's interesting. It all starts with the writing, as they say. If you don't have a good script, right, that's the foundation for everything, for characters, for the soul of whatever piece of art you're creating through advertising in your case. So what year was that? You were quite young, and this is in Mexico still.
Yep.
What agency was that?
And the original agency was Brojeras Oliva y Asociados. It was Pepe and Carlos Brojeras, two brothers. In fact, Pepe Brojeras was also the president of an advertising school. And in fact, he told me, I can get you in, if you're lucky, I can even get you a scholarship. Of course, my dad stopped me on my tracks and said, no, 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 no. If you really want to, do that, with kind of a dismissive attitude, you still need to go to college. So I started researching, and there were a couple of private universities that offered the career of social communication sciences. It was a 5-year career, but the good thing of the career I pursued was that the last 2 years you were able to do kind of a specialization in advertising and TV production. So I worked throughout all my college years. I never stopped working. From Brojeras Oliva, I moved to a slightly larger agency, and then I was very fortunate to be a founding member of an agency called AR Weissner y Asociados, founded by Alfredo Weissner and Jaime Sousa, a dear friend of mine. And Alfredo, who had worked at McCann and a couple of other agencies, Ferrer, which at the time was the largest local agency in Mexico, told me, hey, you're very talented, but you're very young. So I'll hire you, but you need to know that eventually I'll bring someone as head of creative. And at the point, at that point, I said, well, I have a long way to learn. So I was hoping to work under someone that really knew the business. It never happened. He made me a creative director at age 23, and he kept telling me, even though you don't have the kilometers or the mileage, you do have the talent, and not only you're a really strong writer, you understand business problems, and you know how to go about them. So at the end of the day, what we do is help resolve business problems. Creativity, art and science are part of the ammunition, but at the end of the day, we're here to help brands and companies face pain points and challenges.
Absolutely. And so we're going to get to the point because you were, I use this term a lot, like an intrapreneur, right? At 23, you're a creative director. Obviously, they saw something in you. They knew you could lead and be a business person, not simply a copywriter, so to speak. And I want to talk about, your agency, your first one when we opened it. But I also want to talk about the jump from Mexico into US Hispanic. Tell me about that. Why did you make that shift? And I believe I saw you worked at, was it Mendoza Dillon? This is one of the
Yep.
first. Yeah. But tell me about that a little. Then we'll get into your entrepreneurial journey.
Well, for my age, I didn't jump as much as most of the creatives did in Mexico, but from Aire Weisner and Asociados, uh, I was approached by an agency that at the time was called Hart y Asociados, and they were in the process of being acquired by Scally McCabe Slopes, which at the time was like the hottest agency. They did the Butler with Maxwell. They did the Volvo Cage with O.J. Simpson. They were a very iconic agency, and one of the conditions was to go out and find a young and upcoming creative director in order to close the deal. And when they interviewed me, I was very excited because not only the reputation of the agency preceded them, but they had really, really strong creative leaders in New York and in Canada. And as part of the conversations, they said, if you join us, we're going to groom you. You're going to spend time in New York. You're going to spend time in Toronto, and you're going to work with some amazing creatives. So I ended up, joining, and I worked, locally, of course, but I spent time in Scally McCabe Slopes, New York, working under the mentorship of a very, very, talented creative. His name was Jeff Frost. And in fact, Jeff took the leap and went to become the global head of marketing at Motorola. Unfortunately, he passed away relatively young, but I remember, the way he looked at my work and the way he gave direction was, amazing, amazing learning. Then, true to their word, even though things started working out in the agency in Mexico, they sent me to Toronto, and I worked with another amazing creative, Gary Prouk, and he was the head creative for the agency, doing incredible work for Purina and a few other brands. So it was like a crash course, a master class on creativity, and it really helped me compensate for the lack of a creative director that I could learn from. So I was kind of a self-taught creative, but I did have stints working with really, really strong creative directors. From Scally, I stayed there almost 6 years, and I kept getting calls from different agencies. My main account there was Comercial Mexicana, which was one of the largest retailers. And I remember that I think my first or second summer there, the client, a Spaniard, who I really, really liked, he was, very direct, he was a straight shooter. He would tell me, I like this or I don't like this. But he came to brief us, and he said, our sales at the beginning of July really take a dip, and we need to find a way to revert that. I had been to an advertising age conference in Chicago, and I had seen a presentation on Dr. Pepper, and it was so focused on music, and it had kind of a tap dancing beat to it, and flew back to Mexico, and like 1 weekend later, I went to see a comedian called Sergio Corona, and coincidentally, he was also a tap dancer. And as I'm thinking about the challenge of this client and the business problem at the beginning of the summer, I came up with the notion of creating a character which was called Julio, July, Regalado. Regalado like in offers or
Right.
bargains. And funny enough, that campaign is still running after close to 40 years.
Get
It
out of
really, it,
here.
it really turned the whole category on its head, so much so that a couple of years after that, the same client came and said, "We need to continue this until into August." I said, "Well, but the campaign is called Julio, July Regalado." Long story short, I turned him into a genie, and the offers were July 34, 35, and 36. July magically extended. So after my experience with retail and the fact that as a creative, I really embraced retail, a lot of young creatives are not too excited about working on a retail account. I started getting calls from a gentleman called Carlos Herranz, a Spaniard who was the president of McCann in Mexico. And he really wanted me to join McCann to help them with a retailer called Suburbia. And I really liked him. We had great interviews, but I kept telling him, if I'm going to join an agency like McCann, at the time, the largest in Mexico, with an incredible roster of global accounts, I'm not going to go to handle Suburbia, a local Mexican retailer. After, back and forth, he told me, why don't you come? I'll give you Nestle, L'Oreal, Suburbia, and you'll be the new business creative guy. So, I took the leap. I joined McCann in, mid 80s. And fun enough, like a few months after that, he calls me into his office and he says, we have an amazing opportunity. McDonald's is introducing in Mexico, and we've been invited to pitch. We will be the dark horse because Leo Burnett and DDB, Doyle Dale and Bernbach, are pitching, and they are global agencies. And I said, well, let's do this. And I had a friend that had an outdoor company, and I kept seeing that in front of the agency there was an outdoor that was available. So I convinced him to rent it to us, and I posted as the clients came from Oak Brook into the office, McDonald's and McCann, the Big Mac combination. And we landed the account, and I was lucky enough to introduce McDonald's in Mexico. I was part of the team that put the inflatable Ronald on top of the first store, which was in a freeway in Periférico, and it became a cultural phenomenon. It almost replaced a trip to the U.S. Fun enough, that experience eventually led to us winning McDonald's in 94, shortly after we opened the Rivero Messianu. But, from McCann, going back to your question, I ended up being the creative director for General Motors, which was the largest account. That was my last stint at McCann. And out of the blue, I got a call from a headhunter who was looking for a creative director to go work in Newport Beach for Mendoza Dillon, which at the time was, the largest Hispanic
Yep.
agency. And, I came for the interview. I, met the entire team, and they made me an offer, and that was, my jump into the U.S. Hispanic market.
Wow. So let's unpack Del Rivero Messiano, or DRM, as we used to call it. What made you take the jump? So you had the McDonald's account. I guess that's what grounded it. And
No,
then in 94
no,
or no?
No, there, that's the tip of the iceberg. There was a lot underneath, and just going back to Mendoza Dillon, I was there for a couple of years. From there, I was recruited by GSD&M in Austin, Texas, because they were after the course account, and they had heard that there was an opportunity with the Hispanic portion of the account.
Got it.
So eventually, I moved to Austin. Austin was amazing back then, really living up to the motto of keep it weird. I worked on amazing, client businesses. I developed a Hispanic campaign for Don't Mess with Texas, with Lil Joe y La Familia. I was part of the team that worked on Southwest Airlines, SeaWorld. I did the first ever campaign for Walmart for the Hispanic market, Domino's Pizza. And, I was, really getting into it, but my dad fell ill, and I'm the eldest. And precisely at the same time that, my dad developed Parkinson, I got a call from an amazing gentleman called Gunter Saupe, who was the president of Lintas for Mexico and Latin America. And the global chief creative officer for Lintas was a guy named Barry White, who had been the global chief creative officer at McCann when I was there. And he remembered me, and Gunter convinced me to go back to Mexico with a regional role. I was overseeing, different offices. In fact, I spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico and in Colombia. And eventually, but, I was always very transparent. I said, I'm in Mexico. I need to be in Mexico. It's a family reason, but eventually I would like to go back to the U.S. So about 3.5 years later, Lintas acquired an agency here in Miami called GS&B, Garcia Serra and Blanco. And that was the predecessor of Del Rivero Messianu. They wanted me to run the agency, and I kept telling them, I'm a creative guy. I need a counterpart. I need a business person. And Eduardo and I had worked together at Mendoza Dillon. He had left Mendoza Dillon, and I convinced him to move here. And shortly after we opened the agency, it was kind of a transition. We pitched the Continental Airlines account, and in fact, the Bad Bunny concert reminded me of the concept I presented. We were competing against McCann, FCV, and a few, regional powerhouses, and I said, our only chance is to develop an idea that really intrigues them. They were emerging from bankruptcy, and I showed up with at the time two visuals. One was the map of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
and I said, to some this is America, but for others the second one was the continent. For others, America is the continent, and was proprietary to Continental Airlines. So we
Sure.
won the business, and that was the start of the agency. We ended up handling the account, I think, in 20 markets regionally, and that gave us our start. Then this was 93, and mid 93. In 94, we heard that McDonald's was unhappy with their agency at the time, and we made a presentation, and they liked our thinking, they liked our work, but they were concerned that we were too small, and we wouldn't be able to keep up with the pace of an account like that. In between, that meeting and that feedback, a well-known director who unfortunately passed away a few months ago, Pedro Torres, who was married to Lucia Mendez, called me up and said, I just landed a big project for Domec, Brandi Presidente in Mexico, and they're sponsors of the World Cup, and they need a lot of work. So I said, I cannot do it on a freelance basis, but I can do it as an agency. I have a partner, I have a team. So we ended up producing 36 spots in 30 days for the World Cup in 94. And when McDonald's came back, I told them, you were concerned about our size. You were concerned about, our ability to turn things around. In the last month since you were here, I produced 36 spots. I'm not going to show all of them to you, but I'll show you my 8 favorite ones. And that was the clincher. That, that's when we landed the McDonald's account. And, I handled McDonald's for 29 years, including the last couple of years in which, DDB, who had partnered with Alma in 2001, asked me to become the global chief creative officer for DDB, handling McDonald's in 46 countries around the world.
So you know McDonald's, that's for sure. My goodness, boy, did you live that brand. So let me go
Yes.
back though. So you had DRM. How did DRM essentially culminate into Alma? What was the transition there?
In 2007, Eduardo del Rivero left, and I was faced, basically with 3 scenarios: carry on and leave the name as it was, but it was kind of weird because he was gone.
Right.
The second one was, should I change it to just Messianu? I thought it was a little bit too presumptuous. Or let's rename it. This is 2007, and there were 2 things happening. The beginning of SEO, search engine optimization.
Yep.
So I really thought, let me come up with a name with an A, so I'm at the top of the
Literally.
search. And then I've always loved words that begin and end up with the same letter. So when I saw Alma, I said, interesting, soul. And then coincidentally, and it gave me the arguments to push back on a lot of my creative friends and colleagues who kept telling me, people work their entire lives to put their name on the door, and you're the crazy one that's going to remove it. But, I always told them, well, the LM in Alma is Luis Miguel. So it's an Easter egg.
It's so clever. Yeah.
And I developed this mantra, which was, brands like people have soul. We're in the business of turning them into soulmates. And, the clients were soulmates. The team was soulmates. It really created a very interesting culture. And I think most of the people have asked me, what was the secret sauce of the success of Alma? It was the strength of the culture and this, commitment to solving problems strategically, but do it, through creative excellence. And curiosity was a driver, collaboration and accountability. And I'm an eternal optimist, but I'm also one of my bosses at Mendoza, Dylan, nicknamed me the eager beaver. And he said that, I was never satisfied. And it is true. I'm convinced that there's always a better way, and we live in a constant state of betterment. We cannot rest on our laurels.
No, absolutely not. So this is the early-ish 2000s. You transitioned to Alma. Alma was independent until what point? And how did you make that transition to becoming a part of a bigger holding company?
Well, funny enough, DRM for a couple of years was part of DDB, 96 through 98. Kid Reinhardt, who was the founder and the godfather of Omnicom and DDB, had reached out after seeing some of our initial work for McDonald's. In fact, the first time he called, I thought it was a prank call. I picked up the phone thinking that somebody wanted to play a joke on me, but it turned out that it was Keith. He came down. He didn't want to see the books. He just wanted to get to know the people and look at the work. So pretty much with a handshake, we became part of DDB. They had a very small stake at the agency, but part of the objective of becoming part of DDB beyond the connection with McDonald's was access to bigger and better clients. In 2 years, it never happened. So in 98, we went back to Keith and we said, you know what? This is not really working out. We would like to buy ourselves back. And he was a real gentleman. He didn't play any games, and he basically asked the finance team to sell it back to us, at the same price. From 98 to 2001, the Hispanic market exploded, and we were approached by a lot of different networks. Uh, but in most cases, they would send the head of finance, the regional president, and all they wanted to see was the numbers, the books.
Sure.
And I never forgot that when Keith came to see us, he didn't care about the books. He said, we'll get to that, and the finance guys will talk about that. I want to, get to know you. I want to see how you think and the type of creative output that you put out in the world. The last, suitor was BBDO. I met at a cocktail Eduardo Vargas, who was the president for the Americas at BBDO,
Mm-hmm.
and we started conversations. At the time, the biggest conflict was that they were the agency for Pepsi, and we were still the McDonald's agency, and the partnership between McDonald's and Coke, has been so strong, throughout the years. When Omnicom heard that we had started conversations with BBDO, being part of the same holding company, DDB came back and said, "No, come on, if you're gonna partner up with Omnicom, it has to be DDB." By then, we shared not only McDonald's but also State Farm and a few other clients. So we became part of DDB in 2001. And in 2007, they were very keen on me staying and reinventing the agency, and the rest is history. We grew exponentially.
Got it. And what were some of the pros and cons of being a part of a larger holding company as a creative person? Was that in any way confining, or was it business as usual?
All of the above. It was great to have a sense of belonging, and of all the creative agencies, DDB was the creative agency, the legacy of Bill Bernbach, and of course Keith Reinhardt. Things have changed, and now we know that Omnicom merged with Interpublic, but I would say that the last few years, I started seeing a flip. I always talked about three things in strict order: pride, fun, and money. And
Mm-hmm.
that was part of my own philosophy. Uh, the last few years, it was exactly the reverse. It was money, 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 and pride and fun were secondary. And
Yeah,
DDB was an agency that really cared about people and product. Profit was a distant third, but things started changing, and a lot of the decisions were made thinking of money first, as opposed to culture, as opposed to the importance of retaining and attracting talent, and making sure that the creative output was a priority.
I
So
understand.
you know I have to say that I was part of the last leg of an agency that really cared about the right things in the right order. I'm really glad today to be independent because yes, I think holding companies are great, especially for big global brands, but their focus has really shifted to finance, media,
Yeah.
new technologies, not so much the core of this industry.
Understood. Well, the industry itself has evolved so much and it hasn't gotten any easier, and they are a business at the end of the day, right? But I understand where you're
Yep.
coming from. So much, at least from my perception and based on what you're telling me, you gave all of your soul, pun intended, every part of you to creating Alma. What was it like when you transitioned out of Alma? How difficult was that decision for you? You left a part of yourself in Alma. Like, talk to me about that experience personally, what it was like for you.
Well, I couldn't help but to take it personal. As I mentioned before, the last 2 years, I took on a global role. The first year with 50% of my time, the second year with 80% of my time. And in March 2023, right before I always say that our cycle for agencies begins and ends at the end of June with the Cannes Festival, and DDB hadn't gotten Lions for Cannes in I think 6 or 7 years, and I was on a mission to really rebirth that, and I have to say that I left on a high note because we had 15 shortlists and 7 Lions. So I felt pretty fulfilled, but I realized that the partnership between McDonald's and DDB wasn't what it used to be, and I didn't want to be a scapegoat. So I told him I'll close the chapter after Cannes 2023. Uh, they wanted me to go back to Alma, but again, only with 20%. And I kept saying, well, what about the other 80? You're not going to pay me 100% for 20% of my time. And I couldn't reach an agreement, so I launched on my own. In fact, I got a nice write up on Ad Age when I first introduced uh, a creative consultancy called Included. Funny enough,
Right. I remember that.
nobody had thought of the name Included, which is telling for an industry like ours, only to be approached by Pete Lerma, who had been in conversations with Richard Edelman for about a year. And they said, well, we read what you drafted as a manifesto. Would you consider partnering with us? And the original idea was that they would be kind of the power behind Included. We were under the assumption that that would be the name, but a few weeks later, Richard said, I've been doing some research and your name carries weight. I think we should use the last names. And it was kind of weird because I had removed Messianu from Del Rivero Messianu to transition into Alma. Long story short, we settled for MEL, in that order, MEL, because MEL in Catalan and in Portuguese means honey, and have a little bit of concept behind it. So that was the reason and the beginning.
I love it. Is there also a reference to a hive? I forget. And building, group of
Well,
people working together. I
yes.
thought that was part of MEL as well.
Yes. Well, at the beginning, I again looked for a mantra, and I kept referring to the team that I put together as the hype, and we were using metaphors around the bees and how they go about it. We didn't really push too much for that because the agency started evolving and it really morphed into something different from the original
Got it.
vision.
Got it. So it stands for Messianu Edelman Lerma, or MEL. How's it
No.
going? How does it feel? You literally went down to the studs and you're building back up. What is your aspiration with this business?
Well, part of what attracted me to the world of Edelman was learning about the evolution of PR and communications and earned media in particular. Uh, the original vision that Richard had was a Latino earned media company. Uh, After the first year, which I still call a beta year, we realized that positioning ourselves like that, it was a niche of a niche of a niche. So, we discussed, some changes. We made some changes in terms of the team, and surely, slowly but surely, I have turned MEL into a kind of a more traditional advertising agency, but with the edge of, comes planning from the get-go, not as an afterthought, and, this search for earned media, which, has given us kind of a competitive edge. This is an agency that was set up post-COVID, post all these mergers and all these changes in the industry. So as opposed to building a traditional agency from the ground up, I structure it from the top down, hiring very seasoned and very strong professionals, and we operate based on bespoke teams according to each one of the projects. If you will, we're more like a production company with a very strong core team. And depending on the project, we bring in a great base of permalancers, as we call them, people that have worked with me and have worked with my team. And we're having fun. We're gaining traction. Last year, we did a lot of work for Aaron's Furniture. Through that relationship, we landed Brand Smart, which is kind of a Best Buy on a regional basis, very strong in South Florida, and growing very, very fast in Georgia, mainly in Atlanta. And it has a special place in my heart because I remember when I first came to Miami, uh, my weekend trips were to BrandSmart, and at BrandSmart I bought my first TVs, my first appliances. It was kind of a destination. Every weekend they had radio remotes with artists, and it was a place that really had had a piece of the heart of the community, and we're trying to recoup that. Just like a lot of retailers, they have become very transactional, but we are looking for ways to embed some emotional affinity as well.
I love
And
it.
last year, we competed for the Gran Centenario Tequila account. Originally, they didn't want to include us because they thought that we were too new. But thanks to my good friend Victor Paredes from Collage, he was the one that told Priscilla Dunhurt, who's the brand director, you should consider Luis Miguel, you should consider Mel. He's Mexican, he understands the Mexican culture. He loves football because they're sponsors of the Mexico national team, and against some stiff competition, we ended up winning the pitch, and we're having a blast working with this team. They're really special people, and I think we're in the process of creating a very, very, very iconic campaign that is gonna generate quite a bit of talk value.
I love it. No spoilers, but when is the campaign coming out?
Uh, we'll be ready right before the World Cup.
Perfect timing. I love it. I love it. Well, you seem like you're having a blast. I love it. This is a new beginning, but you're fully embracing it. And it's a full circle moment, it feels like, for you. And I sense joy coming out of you for what you're working on, which is what this life is all about, isn't it?
You know, after all these years, you know, this amazing industry and this incredible job, I still see it as a hobby. I've never stopped having fun. I love the industry in spite of everything that has happened, and I love to be able to see how ideas come to life and help brands. Elevate. The mantra for MEL is elevate, which is very consistent with my personal mission since I came to the U.S. Hispanic market. I've said that my mission was to help dignify and elevate the presence of Latinos in the U.S. And we adopted it as a mantra. And the focus is elevate people, elevate brands, elevate the conversation. And now more than ever, given what we're seeing around us, I think we owe ourselves to the communities we represent and serve.
Boy, have you done that. I think you're my third guest who's a professor, or at least you were for a time at, it looks like at UM. I'm counting, I don't know, 7 or 8 boards. I'll rattle some off here. Hispanic Marketing Council, Latino Corporate Directors Association, Center for Hispanic Marketing Communication, Adweek Executive Mentor, Círculo Creativo, 4 A's. Should I keep going here? So talk about paying it forward. It's clearly a part of, what fills you up. And we're lucky to have you in this industry. And you're a true
Thank you.
icon, if I do say so
Thank you.
myself.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's
I appreciate
incredible work. Let's talk just for a minute about, you loosely alluded to the headwinds that the industry is feeling. And everyone knows this concept of DEI being conflated with somehow multicultural marketing and all of that nonsense. Anything you want to say about that and the misconceptions of it?
Well, first of all, and I've been saying this all along, D&I and multicultural marketing are not the same thing. In an ideal world, D&I is more internal. Multicultural marketing is external. Obviously, if you can build a bridge between them and make them consistent and connected, even better. I use 2 metaphors, and I've used them throughout my career. So if you want to go to an ice cream parlor, how would you feel if all they have is vanilla? You go for the different flavors, and that is the beauty of diversity. Having options, having different flavors and
Yeah.
different opportunities. Or if you go to a home improvement chain, how would you feel if they only have beige in the paint department? And I think having a range of colors, a range of flavors, a range of options, and I've structured the teams based on diversity, because you want to have the benefit of different mentalities, different upbringings. I think a lot of multicultural agencies have really prepare themselves much better than some of the traditional general market agencies, because we reflect the audience, and we get it. So I think the pendulum moves from one side to another, and I've seen it go from one direction to the other. It's going to take a while, but I think eventually clients, advertisers will come back to their senses. The growth is coming from the ethnic segments and Hispanics in particular. So if you're a brand, if you're an advertiser, you cannot afford not to connect with this audience, which is younger. We've all seen the data, younger, gaining purchasing power, and impacting culture in many different aspects: music, sports, culture, art, etc., etc. So I think as far as I'm concerned, I'm in the right place. We are a culture first agency, and we'll remain true to that.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Thank you for sharing that perspective. So as we conclude here, Mr. Messianu, whose name was on the, on the door, and then it wasn't, and now it is with M. When people say your name years from now, sir, what do you hope they remember first?
My commitment to this community. I hope to be remembered as someone that really pushed hard to dignify Hispanics and to elevate Latino talent in the industry, and that was the main reason for co-founding Círculo Creativo. I think we have a lot to bring to the party. We are a little bit underrepresented and probably underserved, but Latino talent has made a huge difference, not only in the multicultural space, but we see a lot of creatives running creative departments and companies. Now we're starting to see Latino creatives going to the client side and making a huge difference. The ones that come to mind are Luis Sanchez and Gustavo Sarkis, who together with Patricia Corsi are really changing the game on behalf of Kimberly Clark. If you haven't seen their Kotex and their Huggies campaign, you should, because to me, they symbolize a new day in how we go to market.
I love it. I love it. Well, this is my final question for you, and I've been asking it of most, if not all, of my guests. When the final curtain falls on this thing we call life, this is called Dave of the Dead, actually. So we'll talk about when it all ends, and we're at your funeral and sharing our praises about the incredible human being, that you are and were. What song would you like to be playing at said funeral? And would it be in Spanish, English? Maybe there's more than one. And why would you choose that song?
It will be Imagine from the Beatles.
Really? Okay. Any particular reason why? Any particular line from that?
The whole notion of imagination as a way of connecting with people, with cultures. I'm a huge fan of John Lennon. It's a song that has always touched me. Have many other songs, but if I had to pick one, Imagine would be.
I love it. Imagine all the people.
The people.
There you go.
Yeah, it's a beautiful message, and in fact, it should be an anthem given the crazy world we're living in.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Well, Luis Miguel Messianu, my friend and colleague, icon of the industry that I've worked in for my entire career. It's been a pleasure talking to you today on Dave of the Dead. Thank you so much for being here, and much success in your future, many years ahead.
Thank you so much. Such a privilege to join this amazing initiative.
Thank you. Thank you. Peace.
Life, business, reinvention, and the lessons that outlive us. This is the Dave of the Dead podcast.